As a dungeon master with about 10 years of experience, I was amazed at the amount of ideas I took away from Baldur's Gate 3. It made me think about D&D in a different way and made me excited to try some of these out at my table. These ideas I can break down into 2 different categories. Category 1 covers creative mechanics. This includes things like setting your weapon on fire, explosive terrain, and my personal favorite idea of unique abilities tied to weapon types. All of these are really fun ways to add a little bit of variety to 5th edition combat, which traditionally can feel a little bit stale. The second category has to do with the philosophy behind running the game. This includes things that are more conceptual aside from just combat mechanics. Things like how you handle tense roleplay moments, or how you provide your players with information in different ways. Each of those categories has different topics I want to touch upon, but the first thing any normal person would realize upon jumping into Baldur's Gate for the first time would be the creative mechanics, so let's start there. The first mechanic I want to talk about is the use of terrain. Baldur's Gate 3 use of verticality helped me understand how to make truly unique and meaningful battle maps. A lot of videos covering similar topics immediately talk about the verticality in Baldur's Gate 3, and while I agree that is a huge focal point, there is a lot more to it than just that. In Baldur's Gate 3, through just the introduction, you are introduced to jars with some strange material inside of them, and throughout that introduction you learn that they explode. Or at least you should have learned that they explode. So right away, we know that we can take these jars and use them to our advantage in combat. Alongside that, Baldur's Gate also makes heavy use of line of sight mechanics. It goes without saying that line of sight mechanics should be pretty consistent in your tabletop game, but when you see it done in Baldur's Gate 3, it really helps you visualize the combat scenario. Which leads me back into map verticality. If Baldur's Gate 3 did nothing else, it helps people visualize what is occurring on a tabletop in an easy to understand and interesting way. Popping in and out behind cover to skirt line of sight. Casting Firebolt on a barrel to deal a bunch of damage to a lot of enemies. Or even using your height to your advantage. Baldur's Gate 3 makes it easy to understand how these mechanics work, and more importantly, why they should work the way that they do. As a DM, after playing Baldur's Gate 3, I find myself playing a lot more with terrain in a way that I never thought of before. When you combine all of these elements, the battle map starts to feel more alive. Think about it. Real-life combat is not simply attack and get attacked. Combat is supposed to be dirty, messy, ugly, and these changes help make it feel that way. And this alone can make a huge improvement in making creative combat encounters, but there are 2 other creative mechanics that we can add to really take this up to the next level. So let's talk about coding weapons. Baldur's Gate has what feels like hundreds of different poisons and oils you can apply to weapons with a bunch of different effects. There are some poison rules in 5th edition, but in my opinion, they're a bit underbaked, and as far as I'm aware, there is no other mechanics for things like dipping your weapon in oil and lighting it on fire. Before Baldur's Gate, I never really considered giving my players easy access to poison or even including it in the game. In all fairness, they never asked, but in reality, they shouldn't have to. By simply adding these into the game, whether it be on enemy weapons or through other means, it adds an entire new element to combat and adds some much needed nuance to the game. Now, I will say that the oils and things you can add to your weapons in Baldur's Gate 3 are a bit powerful, so I wouldn't necessarily copy-paste them into your campaign, but rather add more options or create your own. Really, the possibilities here are only limited to your imagination, so go wild. And now we come to arguably the most controversial take on this topic and the final creative mechanic before we move on to game philosophy. And that would be the ability for different types of weapons to have different types of special attacks. In Baldur's Gate 3, different types of weapons have special attacks. For example, large weapons like a greatsword allow you to cleave attack, lacerate the enemy, pommel strike to knock an enemy out. Another large weapon, like the halberd, has 2 of those but replaces the pommel strike with a rush attack instead to charge at the enemy. Meanwhile, smaller weapons like a rapier allow you to make a piercing attack to deal extra damage, a weakening strike to force your enemy to drop their weapon, or a flourish in an attempt to throw your opponent off balance. These are all super fun abilities that aren't tied to a class, but instead the weapon type they are utilizing. This adds a lot of really cool nuance for melee classes, and coupled with the coding weapons rules I mentioned earlier, can really help melee stand out among spellcasters when they're historically known as being weaker in 5th edition. I do, however, have to point out that adding weapon skills like this might feel like you're stepping on the Battlemaster's toes, so keep that in mind if you do decide to implement these ideas. If you want to try to keep it balanced, which I highly suggest you do, I would suggest adding things that don't specifically overlap with Battlemaster maneuvers. At least that way, the Battlemaster still gets something special while adding more options to melee classes as a whole. But that does it for game mechanics. Now we move into the more conceptual as we go into what we learned from Baldur's Gate 3 about the general design philosophy of our games. The first thing I want to bring up here is how Baldur's Gate 3 is guilty of the cardinal sin of D&D, and I bet you didn't even realize it. That's right, break out your train whistles because Baldur's Gate 3 is in fact one very giant railroad, and that's a good thing. Larian did an amazing job taking the restrictions of the video game medium and hiding the fact that the game is very much a linear story. Just due to the nature of it being a video game, there has to be a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion. That's just how video games work. And while Baldur's Gate 3 follows that pattern, how Larian hid that fact is actually quite impressive. Spoiler warning from this point onward, so take a moment if you haven't completed the game to pause this video and come back once you've completed the game. Alright, spoiler warning out of the way, let's talk about the story. It's really just your journey on your way to challenge the absolute and save Baldur's Gate. The story can take many twists and turns, and the ending can vary slightly based on your decisions, but at the end of the day, you always end up in the same spot facing down the absolute in some way or another. The fact that I didn't realize that until writing this script is just a testament to how well Larian did in creating branching pathways throughout the game. Which leads me to my next point, providing multiple avenues for your players to access important information. In the game, you can gain information in a bunch of different ways depending upon the pathways that you chose all the way towards your climactic ending. Regardless of whether or not you took the path through the Underdark or you went through the mountain pass, you generally get the same information, albeit they're using different viewpoints, but they all lead you to your conclusion about how you approach certain scenarios later on. And you might gain different information depending upon your path, but at the end of the day, regardless of your path, you learn about the Absolute, the Chosen Three, and all the important details you need to know about in order to triumph over them. The game perfectly distributes important information to the player, so it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, for the player to miss key story elements. But it also does a very good job rewarding player curiosity by providing additional information the deeper you look that isn't necessary to the overall plot. This allows the player to completely trust the narrator that they will not let the player get lost, as well as that they know regardless of where they go, there is no truly wrong choice. Putting this into the context of a tabletop game, and it's functionally the same. And there is arguably no more important factor in having a successful D&D game than having trust between the players and the narrator, or the DM. And this trust is further built upon with how the Dungeon Master handles the narration of the game, which is actually my next topic, narrating everything. This one might sound a bit obvious, but just think about your time playing Baldur's Gate. Literally everything you do in the game is narrated in the third person by the narrator. The constant narration of your adventure might seem minimal, but when you look deeper and listen to the narrator's choice of words, it is amazing how effective it is at influencing your decisions. That's not to say that they're trying to sway your decision one way or another, but they provide relevant information which you can use to make your decision. As an example, the Shadow-Cursed lands, you meet a character called Karnis the Drider, and the narrator describes how this creature is shifty, but generally unsure of themselves. It does this in a way that might seem inconsequential at first, but if you listen to what's actually being said, you would realize that it's actually giving you a hint on a potential way to deal with the Drider with avoiding combat. You can play on their insecurities, convince him to give you the lantern, and then just walk away. I actually felt bad for the poor guy when I did that, but it is a great example of subtle narration that provides information that can change the direction your players might be going in. This is arguably the most important skill to master and definitely takes some practice, but I guarantee you this is the single most impactful skill a Dungeon Master can have. But let's go back to the Drider example. What happens to them and that group if they give you the lantern and then decide to walk off into the darkness? Well, I won't spoil that, but let's just say that leads us into our next topic, consequences. Now, I don't mean negative consequences like you're in trouble, go to your room. I really just mean the result or effects of your actions. Regardless of what direction the players decide to go throughout the entire story, there is always a consequence of their action. For example, in Act 1, you can destroy the Goblin Camp, or on the flip side, destroy the Druid Grove. Obviously, these are extreme examples of consequences, but if you decide to destroy the Goblin Camp, you'd never meet the potential companion Minthara, whereas if you decide to destroy the Druid Grove, you will lose other companions. Everything you do in the game is cause and effect. If an NPC dies in the attack on Moonrise Towers, they are no longer accessible since they're obviously dead. Even something as simple as your reputation has an effect on the game, as vendors' opinions of you change your interactions and the bartering process. And this is a really nice touch that helps Baldur's Gate 3 hide the railroad and feel much more open than it actually is. Everything you do is felt throughout the world, and it should feel the same in D&D. By doing this, it makes the world feel natural and living rather than static and scripted. And the best part about this is that it requires little effort on the part of the DM because the players are the ones who change the world as they go through the story. Just keep track of certain decisions that the players make, and in between sessions, consider how that might affect the world around them. But I do have one more topic I want to touch upon before I close out, and that would have to do with magic items. This is another controversial take, and one that I don't suggest every DM implement, because it's entirely situational. But if it can work in your campaign, I believe it adds a lot of fun if you do. Baldur's Gate 3 absolutely floods you with magic items. Many of these items weren't exactly qualifiable as powerful, but they were at least unique comparatively to 5th edition. But I want to suggest that DMs use the design concept Larian used for magic items in their own games. Specifically the design of magic items and the sheer amount of them. When it comes to design, think about the amount of boots you have that give you an extra effect when you dash. As far as I'm aware, there is nothing like that in 5th edition, so why not make it? And if that's the case, why stop there? What if you took the dodge action or the help action and gained some bonus? What if boots allowed you to jump high once per day and cause a small quake when you land? That's what I mean when I say unique. Not game-breaking, but interesting enough to make the players want to play with them. These are things that aren't currently used in 5th edition, so don't feel restricted with what's typical in D&D modules, and think about what sounds cool. D&D is a game about imagination, so why not use some of that imagination to create some awesome things that your players can use to make themselves feel more powerful and enjoy it. At the end of the day, we all play D&D to imagine ourselves being cool, right? No? Just me? Anyways, that's everything for this list of what we can learn from Baldur's Gate 3. If you liked the video, I would really appreciate it if you liked, subscribed, and let me know what you thought in the comment section below. I read every comment, almost always reply, and who knows, I might even feature your comment in the next video. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you on Friday.